prison love letters promising forever. A wealthy older man who moved across the country believing in second chances. A carefully constructed manipulation so brazen, it was literally written down in a notebook. This is how Lindsey Downs became one of Love After Lockup's most notorious villains, and how her pattern of destruction finally caught up with her in the most satisfying way possible. From the moment cameras started rolling, viewers knew something wasn't right. But nobody could have predicted just how calculated, cruel, and utterly shameless her schemes would become. Lindsey's story doesn't start with love after lockup. It starts in Mississippi, where she spent years perfecting the art of using people. Her criminal record tells a story of someone who never learned from consequences. Drugs, fraud, multiple prison sentences, each arrest just another inconvenience rather than a wake-up call. While other inmates used their time behind bars to reflect and change, Lindsey was sharpening her greatest skill: manipulation. She discovered that prison dating sites gave her access to lonely men on the outside, men with money who were desperate enough to fall for a pretty face and convincing letters. The pattern was simple but effective. Write sweet messages about wanting to change. Promise a future together. Make them believe they were saving someone who just needed a chance. Then extract as much money and support as possible while giving back absolutely nothing genuine in return. Lindsey never really hid who she was. She was sharp-tongued, explosive, and completely unafraid to show her worst side. Enter Scott Bradshaw, a 51-year-old businessman from New York who became Lindsey's most documented victim. Their prison correspondence started like many relationships on the show, with Scott sending letters and photos, genuinely believing he'd found someone special. But this wasn't a typical pen pal situation. Scott was pouring thousands of dollars into their relationship, while Lindsey sat in her cell planning exactly how to maximize her return on investment. She studied him like a business opportunity, learning which buttons to push and what promises to make. Scott wasn't just sending love notes during Lindsey's incarceration, he was emptying his bank account, preparing for their future. He moved from New York to Mississippi, bought a house, furnished it completely, and created what he believed would be their perfect new beginning together. In his mind, this was romance. He was building a home for the woman he loved, giving her stability and security after years of struggle. For Lindsey, Scott was exactly what she'd always been looking for: a wealthy, naive older man who would provide everything without asking too many questions. The warning signs were blazing from the beginning, but Scott was too blinded by hope to see them. Lindsey's letters were filled with demands rather than affection. She made it clear she expected to be treated like royalty. Scott was more than willing to play the devoted servant, believing that his generosity would be rewarded with gratitude and love. He had no idea he was being set up for one of the most humiliating experiences ever captured on reality television. When Lindsey was finally released from prison in 2019, her true personality emerged immediately. Scott had spent months perfecting every detail of the house he'd bought for them. He'd chosen furniture, decorated rooms, and created what he hoped would be a comfortable environment for her transition back to civilian life. The moment Lindsey walked through that door, nothing was good enough. The house wasn't finished to her impossible standards. The decorations were wrong. Instead of showing even a shred of gratitude for Scott's massive financial investment and effort, she immediately started making demands. Scott, desperate to make her happy, scrambled to fix every complaint. He spent even more money buying new items, hiring contractors, and trying to bring the house up to Lindsey's standards. Every criticism sent him running back to stores or making phone calls, convinced that if he could just get everything perfect, she would finally be satisfied. But satisfaction was never the goal. Lindsey's complaints were about establishing dominance. From day one, she made it clear that she was in charge, and Scott's job was to provide whatever she demanded without question. The pattern became obvious to everyone except Scott himself. Lindsey would complain about something. Scott would spend money trying to fix it. Lindsey would find something new to complain about. The cycle could have continued indefinitely, with Scott bankrupting himself, trying to satisfy someone who had no intention of ever being satisfied. She treated him not like a partner or even a friend, but like a service provider who had failed to meet an important client's expectations. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While cleaning around the house one day, Scott found one of Lindsey's notebooks lying out in the open. Curious and probably already suspicious after weeks of her behavior, he opened it and started reading. What he discovered made his blood run cold and validated every instinct he'd been trying to ignore. Page after page contained detailed instructions on how to manipulate men. step-by-step guides on making them fall in love, extracting maximum amounts of money, playing the victim when they got suspicious. It was like reading a business manual for emotional exploitation, and Scott realized with horror that he'd been living it in real time. When Scott finally gathered the courage to confront Lindsey about the notebook, her response showcased manipulation at its finest. She didn't apologize or show any remorse. She didn't try to explain why she'd written those things. Instead, she immediately went on the attack, making Scott feel guilty for invading her privacy. Lindsey claimed the notebook entries were just quotes from some book she'd read, though she conveniently couldn't remember the title or author. She insisted Scott was paranoid and controlling for reading her personal writings. She turned the entire situation around, making herself the victim of his snooping rather than acknowledging he'd discovered proof of her betrayal. This was classic Lindsey. Take any situation, no matter how damaging to her, and find a way to make herself the wronged party. She could look at the most obvious evidence of manipulation and somehow make the person who discovered it feel guilty for finding it. The gaslighting was masterful in its cruelty. Scott knew what he'd read. He knew what it meant. But Lindsey's performance was so convincing that for a moment, he questioned whether he was overreacting. The notebook revelation was just the beginning of Scott's nightmare. While he worked downstairs like a devoted partner, hammering away and preparing a room for Lindsey's daughter, Miley Grace, something much more sinister was happening upstairs. Lindsey had been hiding a massive secret that would destroy any remaining illusions Scott had about their relationship. For 6 years, she'd been in a relationship with a woman named Tara Bell. This wasn't a past romance or casual friendship. This was an active, ongoing relationship that Lindsey had never actually ended. While Scott poured his heart, soul, and bank account into building their future, Lindsey was maintaining her real romantic relationship behind his back. The betrayal reached new depths when she actually brought Tara Bell into Scott's house. While he worked downstairs like a servant, building furniture for the child from her previous relationship, Lindsey and Tara Bell were upstairs laughing, kissing, and enjoying their reunion in the home Scott was paying for. The image was almost too cruel to comprehend. Scott, completely devoted and working himself to exhaustion, while directly above him, the woman he loved was being intimate with her actual partner. When Scott inevitably discovered this betrayal, Lindsey's response was even more shocking than her actions. Instead of showing shame or remorse, she actually used air quotes when Scott accused her of cheating. She treated the word like it was some ridiculous concept that didn't apply to her situation. Lindsey argued that Scott was delusional and controlling for being upset about her relationship with Tara Bell. She acted as if having another romantic partner living in his house was perfectly normal, and he was overreacting by being hurt. Tara Bell herself confirmed what viewers already suspected. Lindsey only dated men for their money and material benefits. Her real emotional and physical connections were with women. Scott wasn't a boyfriend or partner. He was a walking ATM with feelings that Lindsey barely acknowledged existed. The humiliation was complete. Scott had given up his life in New York, moved to Mississippi, bought a house, furnished it completely, and supported Lindsey financially, all while she was using him for resources and maintaining her real relationship with someone else. The final destruction of Scott's life unfolded in spectacular fashion. Confused, heartbroken, and desperately trying to understand what was happening, Scott reached out to one of Lindsey's ex-boyfriends on Facebook. His message was simple but revealing. He wanted to know if her ex had experienced the same treatment he was enduring. Had she manipulated him too? Was the chaos and emotional abuse part of a pattern? The ex-boyfriend's response confirmed Scott's worst fears, and then some. He not only warned Scott about Lindsey's behavior, but actually called her psycho and advised him to run as fast as possible in the opposite direction. When Lindsey discovered these Facebook messages, her reaction was nuclear. This was fury at being exposed by her own past victims comparing notes. She not only broke up with Scott, but set out to destroy every aspect of his life that she could reach. What followed was one of the most shocking displays of destructive rage ever captured on reality television. Lindsey went through Scott's house like a human tornado, systematically destroying everything he owned. His belongings were hurled outside into the rain. Personal items were scattered across the lawn. Everything he'd worked for and purchased was treated like garbage to be disposed of. Scott could only sit there in shock, smoking a cigarette and watching 2 years of his life get literally thrown away. The man who'd invested his heart, money, and future in what he thought was love could only witness the complete annihilation of everything he'd worked toward. She carved the words "fuck you" into his desk. She destroyed his office, she ripped up important documents, and dumped out his medication. The destruction was personal, calculated, and meant to inflict maximum damage, but Scott's nightmare was finally over, even if it took losing everything to escape. Lindsey's pattern of destruction, however, was just getting started. She wasted no time moving on to her next target. Enter Daonte Sierra, a man who should have known better, but somehow convinced himself his situation would be different. Daonte was already familiar to Love After Lockup viewers from his disastrous relationship with Nicole Bradley. He apparently hadn't learned any lessons about the dangers of dating women in prison. Lindsey and Daonte connected while she was incarcerated again, serving a 24-month federal sentence. They built their relationship the same way she had with Scott, through letters and phone calls. Daonte fell hard, believing he'd found someone who truly wanted to build a future with him. They were already discussing marriage, and forever after spending just one night together in person. But even from their first meeting, the warning signs were obvious to everyone except Daonte. Lindsey was living with a man named Blaine Bailey, someone she described as just a friend, but who clearly played a much more significant role in her life. Daonte's immediate suspicion about Blaine proved well-founded, though it took time for the full truth to emerge. The early days seemed promising on the surface. Daonte was romantic, attentive, and eager to prove himself worthy of Lindsey's love. He spoke openly about their future together, including marriage and building a life as a family. But Lindsey, fresh from her experience destroying Scott, was evaluating Daonte through a purely transactional lens. When she asked to see his credit score and discovered he was drowning in debt, her interest began fading immediately. The relationship was doomed from the start, but Lindsey made sure it ended on her terms. The first major crisis came when she asked Daonte to bail out one of her friends who had active warrants. This was a loyalty test designed to see how far he'd go for her. When Daonte refused to risk his own legal safety helping someone he didn't know, Lindsey's reaction revealed everything. She didn't see his refusal as reasonable self-preservation. She saw it as betrayal. To Lindsey, a real partner would break the law, risk arrest, and potentially go to prison just to help her friends. The fact that Daonte wouldn't put himself in legal jeopardy for someone else's problems proved in her mind that he didn't really love her. From that point forward, she grew increasingly distant and cold. Daonte, confused and heartbroken, tried desperately to prove himself. He increased his efforts to please her, became more attentive, and tried to convince her he was committed to their future. The harder he tried, the more she pulled away. The final breakup was cruel in its calculated nature. Instead of ending things privately with any dignity, Lindsey brought Blaine along for the conversation. Having another man present during the breakup was deliberately designed to humiliate Daonte and confirm his worst fears about Blaine's role in her life. Lindsey's explanation was typically self-serving. She claimed she wasn't happy and didn't see a future between them. She showed no acknowledgement of her own role in creating the problems that destroyed their connection. Daonte's final words proved prophetic. He told Lindsey she would only find happiness when she learned to find it within herself. He recognized what she couldn't see. Her pattern of failed relationships wasn't about finding the wrong partners, but about her own inability to build genuine connections with anyone. After their breakup, Lindsey described the relationship as toxic without recognizing her own contribution to making it that way. In her mind, every failed relationship resulted from the other person's shortcomings, never her own behavior or impossible expectations. The pattern was undeniable to everyone watching. Manipulation, exploitation, blame shifting, destruction. Every relationship followed the same destructive cycle, and Lindsey never learned because she never accepted responsibility. The satisfying downfall isn't just that her relationships failed, it's that she did it all to herself. Every explosive fight, every betrayal, every moment of cruelty was her choice. She had multiple opportunities to change course, to treat people better, to build something lasting. Instead, she chose destruction every single time. Scott could have been her stable foundation if she'd been capable of genuine gratitude or affection. Daonte could have been her fresh start if she'd been able to see him as more than a resource, but Lindsey was incapable of either. She traded all possibilities of genuine happiness for temporary power and control, only to discover that building a life on manipulation is like constructing a house on sand. Eventually, everything collapses. The most satisfying aspect of her downfall is watching karma work in real time. She used Scott until he had nothing left to give. destroyed his property, humiliated him on national television, then watched him walk away and rebuild his life without her. She manipulated Daonte's feelings, tested his loyalty with impossible demands, then discarded him when he wouldn't destroy his own life for her benefit. Both men eventually saw through her act. Both men realized they were better off alone than with someone who viewed them as resources rather than human beings. The Queen of Chaos created her own destruction, and for viewers who watched her hurt decent people season after season, justice was finally served. Lindsey's story stands as proof that treating people like disposable resources eventually leads to being alone. Her manipulation tactics worked in the short term, extracting money and support from men who genuinely cared about her. But the long-term cost was isolation, repeated incarceration, and the certainty that nobody who really knows her will trust her again. She got exactly what she deserved. Nothing. No loving partner, no financial security, no stability, and no respect from anyone who witnessed her behavior. That's not just karma. That's the inevitable result of a life built on using others.